more resources, visit rym.org.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
The Local Youth Worker is a daily podcast that's centered on 5 questions each week. Ranging from the practical to the professional, we're looking for answers to the questions you're asking. Whether you're in full-time, part-time, or even volunteer youth ministry, this podcast is for you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Local Youth Worker, a daily podcast brought to you by Reformed Youth Ministries. I'm your host, John Parrott. All this week, we'll be talking to Lara Jensen. Lara, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Good. Lara is the Assistant Director of Youth Ministries at Redeemer Church in Jackson, Mississippi. Lara, how long have you been there?
I've been there for 6 years. I interned for 2 years in college, and then I've been on staff for, I want to say 4 years, but it could be 3. So 5 to 6 years.
It kind of all starts to run together. It can be hard to,
it does.
to keep up with it all.
It does.
Well, Lara, thanks so much for coming on the show this week. As those who listen to the show frequently, you know that our theme for the show has been frequently asked questions for this second season of the podcast. And we're actually going to take a little bit of a detour from that today, and that relates to just our conversation with Lara. What was interesting when I sent Lara some of the frequently asked questions, we just started to discuss how ministry context, drastically changes the questions that we're dealing with and the questions that we're wrestling with. And we've said that on this podcast, that without a doubt, people are going to have different questions in different contexts. So Lara and I decided that we would have a conversation about just ministry context, specifically diversity and multi-ethnic churches, which is definitely the case at Redeemer Church in Jackson. We'll kind of get into that a little bit more in later episodes. But we thought it'd be a good idea for Lara to introduce herself more and to talk about her family. So, Lara, you ready to get into the first question for today?
Yeah, sounds good. I'm ready.
All right. So, Lara, I guess just as I said, would you just begin by telling us about your family, where you grew up, a little bit about your siblings, and then just kind of how you've moved around and then, ended up in Jackson, Mississippi?
Yeah, so I'm the youngest of 10 siblings. So I come from a big family. So all of my siblings and I, we are actually adopted. So from all over the world, well, not all over the world, but over the world. I have some siblings who were adopted from South Korea, and some of my other siblings were adopted from the Philippines. And then I have one brother who is adopted from Florida, and then I'm adopted from Jersey City, New Jersey, just right outside New York City. And so, and then both my parents are Americans, and born and raised here in the United States. And so, yeah, it's a big family. It's a diverse family, culturally, racially, even as far as language as well, because not all of us were adopted when we were babies. So I was adopted when I was a baby, but some of my other siblings came over to the United States when they were 12 or 13. And so some of them didn't speak or hardly spoke English. Wow. Yeah. And then 2 of my brothers from the Philippines came over with just a brown paper bag and hardly spoke English. So the language barrier played into effect in my family as well. And so when I was adopted, my family was living in New Jersey at the time. And then from there, I've moved around a lot. And so home is not one particular place for me. It's sort of been several places. And so from New Jersey, we moved to Boston, Massachusetts, a town actually 5 minutes outside of Boston called Brookline. And that place, that place, especially, I mean, Boston in general is a great city. If you've never been there, I suggest you go.
Yeah, it's on my list of places I want to visit for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, it's a really neat city. But that was a place for me that has just been, I guess, the most significant place. And even though I was at a young age, in early elementary school, just the experiences that I had there are probably the most memorable. And so, yeah, from Boston, we moved to Montreal, Canada. And this is all because of my dad's job, just moving around a lot. And so we moved to Montreal, and that's also a fun city. And so, growing up and moving around, I've been to several different schools, and so diverse schools. The school in Montreal was very, I want to say it seemed at a young age that every nation was represented at that school. I know that wasn't the case, but I mean, there were people from all over the world. It was incredible. And so that was a really neat experience to have that. And then from there, probably the biggest culture shock in my life was moving to Alabama, a small town in Alabama. Yeah. So we lived there for 5 years, and that time was the hardest time of my life, just given the different experiences, and so at first I went.
I'm sorry, Lara. What age did you say that was when you moved to Alabama, and what grade?
So it had to have been 5th grade.
Okay.
I was going into 5th grade. Yeah. And so, the school that I went to there, was going from a school where pretty much every nation's represented to a school where I was the only person of color. And my sister was the only one who was Asian. And so, it was a culture shock. And so, so from there, lived there for 5 years, and then my family moved to New York, and not the city, in the Adirondack Mountains, which is about an hour north of Albany, the capital. And so I did my high school years there, so 9th through 12th grade, and that place in New York has always sort of been a stable place because my family growing up went to a Christian camp there, pretty much my entire life. So even though we moved around a lot, New York was really the stable place out of all the moves and transitions. And so, and so definitely have moved around, and it's,
and to ask you a question, I think of I grew up in small town Mississippi, and I went to a private Christian school until junior high, and then 7th grade I moved to a large public school, and I was terrified moving from my kind of small environment to this new big school, so many more people. And so for you, I mean, as you're saying all of this and you're moving all over the place, did you? Yeah. And I know you said Alabama was the toughest transition in the culture shock, but as you were moving to these other places, did you feel like you were able to transition well, or were you dealing with a lot of nerves, or were you able to make friends easily because of all of these moves?
I
think you just answered the question.
Looking, when you're in it, it's like, oh my goodness, I felt like stability was being ripped out from underneath me. And so, the younger I was, I think the easier sort of the transition was, because when I was younger, I was the kid who would just talk to anybody on the playground or in the classroom. But then once I started to get to middle school and I became more aware of myself and the insecurities started really sort of piling on, I think the more the transition was harder, because then I had the thought of, what do people think of me? What are they gonna think of me? Whereas in elementary, I didn't really care. I was like, no. If they don't like me, they don't like me. But yeah, I think the more aware I became of myself as I was kind of learning about my identity, I think the more the transition was hard. And even making friends when I was older can be a harder experience. Especially when kids have lived maybe in that same town their whole life, and so they're established, and you come, and so I've really fallen into pits where I've become friends too fast with people, and I've been kind of hurt in that way because I didn't know them, and so I immediately trusted someone. It's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have trusted them that fast. So just learning that with friendships as well with the movie.
Yeah, and as you say, Alabama was the biggest culture shock. And you were there, didn't you say 5 years? Is that right?
Yeah, 5 years.
Did you ever feel like you could call Alabama home? Did you feel like you settled in there, or was it just a tough 5 years there until y'all moved on from there?
Yeah, it was a tough 5 years. I think deep down inside, I wanted to call it home because, we all have that longing for home. And so I think I was longing for that, but I knew like it was never going to be my home. So it was more of like, I just need to survive this. And hopefully we will move again. So yeah, it was more just surviving than anything else.
Yeah. Well, that's just so interesting just to hear your life and hear how much you've moved around. And I know we're starting to wrap this up a little bit, but can you tell us how you transitioned or how you eventually moved to Mississippi? And then that'll probably lead us into the next day.
Yeah. So when we were in Alabama, my sister actually graduated from a school in Alabama, and we heard about Belhaven University in Jackson through our pastor there. And so she went to school there, and I had an opportunity to move her in, but also to visit her for a week when I was in middle school. And ever since then, I knew, I was like, Belhaven is where I want to go to school. And then we moved to New York, and I still, like, senior year, I was like, no, Belhaven. My mom said, maybe you should look in other schools. And I said, oh, okay, fine, I'll do it. But I got accepted into Belhaven, and then, moved down to Jackson, spent 4 years. My sister remained living in Jackson, so she had already been going to Redeemer, and she said, you need to go to Redeemer. It wasn't like, oh, you have a choice. It's like, no, you're going to. And
you have no choice.
That's how I got plugged into Redeemer as well.
All right. And did you just jump straight into the youth ministry when you went there, or did you attend for a time and then gradually get into youth ministry?
Yeah, no, I did not jump into youth ministry right away. I want to say it was probably 2 years or 3 years that I spent just kind of sitting on a Sunday morning at Redeemer. And then I knew I wanted to become a member, first because I had never been a member of a church. And so that was sort of like, oh, cool, I can do this and become a member. And so I became a member. And then our youth pastor at the time, he reached out to me. And so I put that I was interested in youth ministry, but I didn't know kind of as a college student how to get involved in that way because I was too shy to just sort of jump in and be like, all right, I'm going to do this. So yeah, it was kind of a cool experience how that worked out.
Yeah, that's great. And that was Ryan Dean, by the way. Wasn't that Ryan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Ryan Dean.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, Lara, again, that's interesting just to hear your story, hear how much you moved around, and just we can probably spend several podcasts just talking about each different location and what the Lord taught you through those. But thanks for sharing that.
Hey, you're welcome.